This was a dumb idea. This was a bad idea. Hello, angels. As usual, my name is Lavender, and this is my music corner. And I'm sorry for what you're about to see. In case you're unfamiliar, occasionally on this channel we do discography rankings. Something I like to do when a band either releases 10 records, a nice round 10 number, or when they've recently broken up and we're looking back at their catalog and their output. And if you didn't know, recently this band, Panic at the Disco band, recently called it quits. The project of frontman, Vegas singer-songwriter Brenden Urie, which started as a group and was slowly whittled down just to him by their last 3 albums. Now, I'm not a Panic hater. There have been points in my life where you could argue that I'm closer to a Panic apologist than a Panic hater, but I've also never really been a Panic fan, and that puts me in a unique position with a lot of these records. Because of the age that I am, I suppose, I have different relationships with a lot of these albums, and those relationships have changed drastically over time. This is one of those bands whose material I was introduced to largely before I was even that into music, and that means that the journey I have gone on with the band's first 4 or 5 records is ever evolving, and there is a lot of context to it, and that informs some of my feelings about them. So this band made 7 albums, and if you're a fan, I apologize for what I'm about to say, but I don't like most of them. In fact, if I took a really, really strict criteria in terms of records I like, capital L like if they were brand new that I would give a real positive review to, they have 1. But I guess we'll get there. For now, let's take on the worst stuff that Panic has to offer on the very back end of their discography. Starting this off, number 7, in my opinion, the band's worst album is their 4th album, 2013's Too Weird to Live, Too Rare to Die. If you didn't just click away as soon as you heard me say that, hear me out. There was a time when I had a little bit more appreciation for this record. I mean, I was in middle school when it came out, and there were a lot of people around me listening to it and enjoying it, and I enjoyed some of the singles here, so I fully expected when I revisited the project for this video not to like it or to love it, but to continue to see something in it. But after 3 listens through this thing, if you asked me to name even one redeemable factor about this album, the gears in my brain would start to smoke and catch on fire. This record is so fucking obnoxious. It is just garish on the ears. So many of the louder points on this album, handled by Brenden Urie's soaring, piercing vocals, are just unbearable, and they're made even worse by this crumbly, flat, very dry vocal processing and mixing. The singing on this album is just some of the worst recording I've ever heard. It sounds horrible throughout. And it's not like the production is any better on the instrumentation and mixing side of things. This thing is such an obnoxious, overbearing pop album, but it's almost like they're not willing to fully commit to that, so it has some elements that are rough around the edges in places that you really don't want to be. Now, I wasn't really looking into that deeply at the time, nor did I have the faculties to when I was a middle schooler listening to this record, so I anticipated that some of what were my favorite songs and the biggest songs at the time I would return to and enjoy here, and the door was slammed in my face in that regard the moment I heard This Is Gospel Again. But the real offender is Girls, Boys, Boys, a song I anticipated still enjoying, and yet now I realize that it's the worst chorus that Panic at the Disco has ever written, still to this day. I hate this record. This is a disgusting album to listen to, and I just would have never imagined how much I wouldn't like it after just 5 years maybe since the last time I heard this thing. It fell further than any other record on this list, and now I can't really even think of a single thing I would ever want to hear again, a single moment that I would ever revisit in the entire track list. Number 6, let's get even cringier on the band's 7th and final album, 2022's Viva Las Vengeance. This album is fucking ridiculous. I don't understand the ambitions behind this project. You could tell from the singles that kick off the record, like the title track and Middle of a Breakup, that it's just Brenden Urie leaning into his grandest pop ambitions. This thing is huge. It is so theatrical, but in such a plain, just like white bread ass way. But it saves its most absurd and ridiculous moments for its deep cuts, because oh my god, anytime that this thing undergoes any kind of experiment, it just completely blows up in the album's face. Having to listen to the tracks Star Spangled Banner and God Killed Rock and Roll back to back is one of the most unpleasant experiences I had reviewing albums last year. So yeah, even though this thing has been out for less than a year, I still do not see much to it. I guess I can appreciate in concept Brenden Urie chasing after some of the boldest and most unique stylistic elements of what Panic at the Disco had evolved into over the years. I'm just not sure it adds up to anything when all is said and done. I don't completely despise this record start to finish, but that's almost just because it is risky enough for some of its failures to be kind of interesting. And if I haven't lost you yet, I think I'm about to. Number 5, Panic at the Disco's 2011 third album, Vices and Virtues. Here I am composing a burlesque out of where they rest their necks. I have always hated this record. In fact, until Viva Las Vengeance came out last year, I thought that this was far and away my least favorite of all of Panic's albums, and that is because principal songwriter Ryan Ross leaves the band in between their second and third albums, and before they completely become the Brenden Urie theater kid pop extravaganza down the road, they make this stop on Vices and Virtues, where they are still trying to be a Tumblr core 2000s pop punk act, just without any of the defining features that were brought by the songwriter who made them unique in the first place. The thing I hate most about this record is the resistance to change. It is so clear here that Brenden Urie thinks that fans want more of the first two albums, and he's trying to give them that. He just can't. And the result is a single that a lot of fans seem to like at the time and still seem to like to this day, The Ballad of Mona Lisa, but in my opinion, this is one of the worst written and just worst period Panic singles of their entire discography. And like almost every single Panic album, as they get later and later into their career, this thing starts off with some of its worst material. Listening experiences are front-loaded in the worst way. One of the things I will say for this record, and one of the reasons that it's crawled out of the gutter, is that there are some genuine highlights on here. This is the first project I've talked about so far in this video that I think has songs that are good, that I revisit on their own. I think that the track Always is one of Panic's better ballads. I think Sarah Smiles is this interesting kind of surrealist heartbreak anthem. And the album closes with one of my favorite Panic at the Disco songs of all time, period, Nearly, which is a wonderful, exuberant, and constantly shifting finale to the record that has these glittering high points that I just adore. It has a lyrical sentimentality that I find really, really compelling. I like this song a lot. But when push comes to shove, I just do not like this album. Problems that I had with it when I was first listening to Panic's discography still persist to this day, and while I don't think that this record has gotten any better. I think the only reason it moved up on this list is because the other Panic albums have gotten worse. So after I had listened to each of these records a couple times and was sitting down to make this list and to highlight what I wanted to talk about, there were a lot of really easy choices. To me, the 1 and 2 spots were easy to pick, and the 5, 6, 7 spots were easy to pick pretty much immediately. But I sweat a lot over what would be 3 and what would be 4. And I was just fighting my instincts while listening to these albums with my ambitions of listening to them over time and watching them change over time, trying to cut out all of the noise and just focus on the music. And the result of that was a decision that I think will surprise a lot of people. Number 4, a record that a lot of people have often said is one of Panic's worst, their 2018 album, Pray for the Wicked. Now, I get why people hate this, and you could boil it down to 2 words: high hopes. The most obnoxious single of Panic's entire career, a full-throated embrace of Brenden Urie's overwhelming poptimism, is just so unbearable, and it's so unbearable in such a brash and impossible to ignore way, and I don't think he did himself any favors by following it up by joining as a feature on one of Taylor Swift's worst singles of all time, the song Me. I also don't think he did himself a favor with Hey Look My Made It, another song on this record, which just also is just too much. I am just not okay with Brenden Urie giving this much of himself to a song because it is fucking cringy. But genuinely, there are songs I like on this record, and it's one of the only Panic at the Disco records that, in my opinion, starts off with some of its best material. The tracks Fuck a Silver Lining and Say Amen Saturday Night are easily the 2 best in the entire track list, and they're right there at the front. If anything, I was surprised to enjoy this record a good bit more than when I originally reviewed it, and maybe just looking at it within the context of Panic at the Disco's entire development made its poppy sentimentalities just click for me a little bit. Yeah, this thing still has plenty of deep cuts that are either painfully boring or extremely obnoxious, but there are even deep cuts in the mix like Dying in LA and King of the Clouds that I think are decent songs as well. I treat this album as sort of a litmus test for Panic at the Disco. It is right down the middle. It is not awful. It is not great. It is just the center. It is okay. It is an extremely mixed bag of highs and lows. And I think if you see it as anything other than that, you might be coming to Panic at the Disco with a place of uncompromised bias. If the ideal time to get into Panic at the Disco is somewhere in your teen years between 13 to 15, let's say, then the only album they have that slips into that category for me is the 3rd best album of their career, 2016's Death of a Bachelor. Man, I do not like this album as much as I used to. Not that I was ever head over heels for this thing. I always thought that there were about 5 or 6 decent songs in the track list here, but God, does it also have some of the most obnoxious songs of Panic's entire career. Listening to Crazy Equals Genius and Don't Threaten Me with a Good Time never got any easier. But for the most part, the songs I used to like, I still like. While I kind of forgot how obnoxious and occasionally overbearing the drums on the title track Death of a Bachelor are, I do think that it leans into the swelling ballroom mystique of this character that Brenden is trying to step into quite well. And I also think there's 2 more deep cuts here that I really, really like. The 1-2 punch of Golden Days and LA Devotee is really exciting. It makes for a great point in the middle of this record. I wouldn't say this album is good. I would say that it suffers in similar ways to both of the records that came before and after it in terms of the principal pop production and Brenden Urie's willingness to pursue very bad ideas and do them to an awful extent. But there are also just moments here that I find undeniably and uncontroversially enjoyable, and I can't say that about a whole ton of Panic at the Disco records, so honestly, I think that number 3 is a good spot for this thing. So to me, this is when we finally elevate from records that feel like I have to compromise in order to say anything good about them to records that I actually like, and yet I think I'm even going to start this entry off on a pretty negative note. Like many people out there, my second favorite Panic at the Disco album is their second album. Pretty odd.
Back to the street where we began, feeling as good as lovers can.
And really the only issue I have with this album now is I just don't like it as much as I used to. Fan favorites on here that used to be favorite songs of mine, like 9 in the Afternoon and Mad as Rabbits and That Green Gentleman, still sound okay, fine, acceptable, but they are just not hitting like they used to. And I know the stories of drug use turning this into a rambling, wandering, psychedelic odyssey were aplenty on Tumblr around the time that this record was coming out, and I don't know how true those things are, but you can kind of tell when you hear it that this is a much less focused take on Panic's sound. Despite that, there are still highlights abound. I still really appreciate the songwriting of Ryan Ross on this record. I think that Brenden Urie has yet to graduate into the all-consuming ego that would one day take over the entire Panic at the Disco brand, and you can see that on this track list when he is sometimes willing to step back. I think this is a perfectly decent record, far from a sophomore slump, but the only thing I can say about it is that I used to really think about it as Panic's 1B to the 1A of their best record, and now I just think that this thing falls firmly short of the record we're about to talk about. Now, if you've already left 27 angry comments, here is the opportunity for me to give you, and apparently your favorite band, the flowers that they deserve, because my favorite Panic at the Disco record, one of my favorite pop-punk records of the entire 2000s, compared to the rest of their discography, it is not even close, is their debut album, A Fever You Can't Sweat Out.
Sit tight, I'm gonna need you to keep time. Come on, just snap, snap, snap your fingers for me.
Alongside Pray for the Wicked, I would say this is the one Panic album that I like more now than I ever did before, and I think it's just because in that time, I became a writer. I see this album as existing somewhere along the scale of Fall Out Boy and Vampire Weekend in terms of the snark and attitude that Fall Out Boy brought to their songs, but they were never really all that clever, funny, or well-written. When you take something like Vampire Weekend that is occasionally quite overwritten, very smart, but not often with a whole ton of attitude and humor, A Fever You Can't Sweat Out is like somewhere in the middle of those. This album is funny. Like, genuinely funny. It's fucking hilarious. It has plenty of sharp, witty, satirical jabs at the industries of pop and culture that the band was about to enter. Tracks like easily the best song of their entire career, the only difference between Martyrdom and Suicide is press coverage, have the witty and intelligent edge of great songwriting to back them up. But of course, this thing also has huge fan favorites. Obviously, the track I Write Sins, Not Tragedies, which can still whip 2000s kids into a karaoke frenzy at a moment's notice, as well as Just Girly Things Tumblr page favorite Lying is the Most Fun a Girl Can Have Without Taking Her Pants Off, which is a pretty erotic song for how young me and many other people were being exposed to it. But just stopping at those highlights, those peaks, those most well-known tracks does this record such a disservice, because this track list is full of great songs. Build God Then We'll Talk, London Beckons Songs, Time to Dance, But It's Better If You Do. It is just one highlight after another. I've heard plenty of people and read plenty of critiques that say, for one reason or another, that this record does not deserve the fondness it is remembered by. And I had some of that going into my head while re-listening to it, but ultimately, this thing pops with mixing, instrumentation that is versatile, and effective songwriting that is endlessly fun to pour through, and great performances all around. I have very little that I think is wrong with A Fever You Can't Sweat Out. And for that reason, I think that it's not even close in terms of this ranking. I knew going into it, and definitively throughout the entire time of listening to their music, making and writing this video, it was so obvious that this debut album is so much better than everything else they've ever done. I think it's better than the greatest hits of their next 6 albums. And I think it ranks among the upper echelon of 2000s pop punk. I mean, if you take a record like American Idiot and the entire My Chemical Romance discography out of the question, Fever can go toe-to-toe with any pop punk of this era. And that's it. Another discography ranking in the books. We will return to this format at some point when some high-profile band or artist breaks up or retires or reaches 10 albums, because then we'll do that again. But yeah, in a couple weeks, we've got what is always one of the biggest undertakings and most talked about videos on this channel, the best records of the year so far. 2023 has a deep well of great records under its belt already, and I am real excited to dig into some of them and to talk about them. Look forward to it. That'll be out in a few weeks. Kisses. Mwah. See you then.